Thank you, sound effect. Speaking of, did everyone notice that there was a tram? Yes, the tram dog. I'm talking about the tram races that happened last night on the interweb. There's information about it on the Discord. It's terrifying. Anyway, I'm going to leave you all in the capable hands of Benno, another well-credentialised goth and ranter from way back, who's here to give us a rant of some sort, possibly several. Make yourselves comfortable.
How many do you want? So one of the bits of feedback I got for my proposal when we were doing a review was that some people didn't get what I was getting at with the title, so I've provided a bit of a definition up here. It's gamer speak, so you know it's online-y kind of stuff. Anyway, so once upon a time there was this guy who stood up at a conference, it was in New Zealand I believe, and said words to the effect of, you know, nerds especially have a really complicated relationship with change. You know, we love it to pieces. You know, change is awesome when we're the ones doing it. And as soon as change is something that's coming from outside of us, it becomes untrustworthy and threatens what we think of as the familiar. So, yeah, that was me. And that was in a talk that got a little bit of attention, and it was a little while ago. But some people got the point of that talk and others didn't. And so just to save you having to watch the whole thing, it was about rejecting the new thing just because it's not the old thing and why that's bad. It wasn't actually about systemd per se, but it wasn't. And I bring this up because I'm about to talk about one of the bigger changes that's happening in our industry, or at least my industry, that I can remember. And spoiler alert, I'm not a fan. That said, there are some similarities in the origin of this talk and the systemd talk, in that both of them came about from me asking. Well, the first one came about from me asking why everyone seemed to hate systemd, and this talk came about from me asking, why do I find all this AI stuff so off-putting? To put it mildly, there's elements that really sort of just... And I'm just going to do a quick linguistic thing here. I don't like the term AI for this. I don't think it's artificially intelligent. And I mean, the philosophy zone can come for me. And the nature of intelligence and all that kind of stuff. Whatever, come find me outside or don't. But I'm going to be using large language models because I feel that's more accurate and it's my talk and I can do what I want. So to get back to my point, why do I find all this LLM stuff so off-putting? So one of the more amusing outcomes of the systemd talk was that everyone decided that I knew what systemd was and exactly how it worked, and I was the world's biggest expert. I know of it. I use it. I don't think I've ever looked at any of the source code. Educated user, maybe. But I mean, so what do I do? What is relevant to this? And what I have is, to paraphrase a 17-year-old movie, it comes down to I have a very particular set of skills. I've acquired them over a very long career. They're skills that make me quite valuable to certain people. When they have problems, I'll look for solutions, I'll find them, and I'll implement them. So it comes down to skills. Like, I have skills to offer, skills that in my case are based primarily around knowing things, but also knowing how to use the things that I know effectively in situations and adapt them and so on and so forth. But why do I find all this LLM stuff so off-putting? The first, part of it's purely personal. I just find them irritating. There's a whole bunch of ways in which I don't like what they do, but I mean, part of it is just change. I mean, I did a whole talk about why we shouldn't just reject change just because it's change, and here I am rejecting change. But it comes down to, I think, the distinction here, and this is where I'm going to get a whole bunch more comments about systemd stuff, is that I feel like, unlike the systemd thing, this is forced change. The systemd people will tell me that systemd was forced upon them, and I will look at them and smile and nod and walk away. But the reality is that I just resent the notion that I am going to be told how I need to do my job. And there are some, and this is one of the things I've noticed is there are two kind of, more than two, but there are broad camps where I have seen a whole bunch of people who are quite willing to use these tools, and that's fine. I'm not going to tell them how they should work, because that would make me an even bigger hypocrite. But I feel like there are some people for whom having the code is the outcome and they don't mind how they get there, but that's not me. My purely personal beef with this is that I need to have my head stuck right into the code. I need to know what it's doing. I need to know where it is. I need to know what it thinks it's doing and why hasn't it come home. And I just, these tools just get in the way of that for me. It just doesn't work. But sort of digging into this further is like, what is the societal change that this thing represents for me? So digging into it further. This is a term that's used by a certain, political bent, but skating straight past that for just the moment, the whole point of learning things is to gain knowledge, right? We need to learn how to do things. We need to learn the structures of a language. We need to learn the API service of a library. We need to know what the semantics of a given method are. These are all concrete bits of knowledge. And this is where, those of us with, beards my colour, or at least, the age that would get you a beard of this colour, can remember a time before things like Stack Overflow or even GitHub existed, that time did exist. And the challenges of finding out anything about how something worked, and you had to go to a much greater length of that. And this is something where LLMs can help. They act as a form of search engine in this regard. Using them as a code generator can be effective, but my contention is that knowledge isn't the end state of learning in and of itself. And so if we try to distinguish skills from knowledge, you gain a skill for the purpose of applying it. You can apply knowledge, but that this is where I'm constructing a distinction here. Leave me alone. Knowledge can be gained from a whole bunch of other purposes. Like you don't learn about the entire tram network of Victoria because you're looking to run it necessarily. You just want to talk about it with your friends. But if you see skills as kind of being knowledge plus understanding, it's a pithy way to put it. It might not be accurate, but there's enough truth to be able to make a couple of points from it. The main one being that LLMs embody knowledge. They know for a given sequence of tokens what tokens are likely to come next. They know for a question what the shape of an answer might be. They don't understand that, though. They don't understand why you get from here to there. They can give you some of the reasons why other people have given as to why that might be the case, but that's still sort of in the vicinity of just regurgitating the textbook rather than actually understanding what's going on and conveying that. To develop skills, you have to be able to develop understanding. And LLMs can point us that way, but you have to develop the understanding on your own if you're using the output from an LLM. That kind of approach can work. I mean, a similar approach worked for me. I am not the best at just receiving knowledge from someone standing on a stage. I learn things by having projects to work on. I learn things by pulling things apart. I am terrible at dealing with other people's code because I will basically learn it by reformatting it. But other people work differently. But the way that you come to understanding is, coming to the understanding is the important point. And what can really help with that is things like effective mentoring. But to be an effective mentor requires not only understanding the problem space you're working in, but understanding the student. And understanding why they're making certain mistakes, why they're not getting to where they need to be, and helping them realise that and move on. Sometimes it can even just be understanding that their problem isn't any lack of knowledge, but just lack of confidence. And we've seen what happens when people try to use LLMs to build up their confidence. Like any kind of, don't go to LLMs for therapy, people, just don't. So coming back to this line, we used to make things is a line that's trotted out by people of a certain political, economic bent, and like all good, short, pithy statements, it has a grain of truth in it. A lot of Western economies used to have a lot of manufacturing in them. Then starting in the 70s and increasingly in the 80s, a lot of that moved offshore. Why? Well, we got better at moving things around, on one hand, but we got better at moving physical objects around, and we got better at moving money around. And it became a lot easier for you to do the making of an object in one place and then get it to the market you wanted to sell it in. And why would you even bother doing that? Because it was cheaper. Sorry, I'm losing where I am in my notes. Yeah, so we got better at moving things around so that you could get the components that you needed in one location, put the thing together, put it on a boat, send it over, sell it somewhere else. And not only that, you could get the money to where it needed to be in order to make that happen. And you combine that with the fact that countries like China, India, others were getting to the point where they had the ability to have these factories constructed there, but that their workforces were not necessarily as, their standards of living had not increased to the point where they were as expensive as people in the countries that they were moving out from. You could just move everything over there and it became cheaper. And naturally, this is a great deal for the people who were looking after the money, but a terrible deal for the people who had been doing the work. And it also turns out that a lot of those, Jesus, sorry, I've mucked this one up completely. So, yeah. Right, yeah, it works great provided you don't get big boats stuck. And so, exactly, why would you want to? Your money's portable. You can move it there. A lot of the deregulation during the 70s and 80s was about allowing capital to move from one place to another. And so you can get your money to where it needs to be to make that happen. But the labour can't move and seek better conditions elsewhere. And the grim comedy that comes along with this is that the same people who were telling us that this was all a really good idea because we get cheap televisions, they are working against the people who just lost all their jobs, and those people, it turns out, they vote. And so those people these days are looking for a reason why this happened. But the biggest issue really, and the one that I want to focus on here, is that all those skills that were involved in manufacturing went away in a lot of the economies that are doing this. The US being an obvious example, but it's not alone. Manufacturing is a huge industry that has many layers to it. The obvious one is the workers in the factory themselves assembling the products. That's one set of skills, because as much as various people are going to claim that this is unskilled labour, I would challenge any of the people saying that to actually do that kind of work at the rate that they'd be expected to do it. But the components that go into that manufacturing process also have to come from somewhere, and those could be individual components, screws, parts, whatever, but they could also be the things that make the parts. And so there are sort of skills further back in the chain, tool and die manufacturing, which is where you actually make the things that make the parts that go into the things. Those don't exist in the US anymore either, because when the factories moved, the skill sets required moved with the factories. And so you can't necessarily get that done in the US anymore. You can find a bunch of stories online where someone goes and tries to make a brand new, completely made in the US product, and they can't, because they first go, right, I just need someone to put my product together, and they have trouble finding a factory that's going to do that. But then once they've found that, they then need to get the tools and dies and whatever to make the parts that they need, and if they can find a factory that does that, most of the time the actual design and construction of the tool, of the dies and molds and everything that's used is done elsewhere, generally China. The people that had those skills lost their jobs, and they weren't able to pass those skills on. They weren't able to mentor the next generation of people who would be doing those jobs, and so those jobs aren't there anymore. And so this is one of my big worries when it comes to large language models and their use in coding, is that if we allow skills around coding to atrophy in the same way in our societies, then we end up in a similar situation where the skills that we need to do that kind of work are not here anymore, and we are required to go elsewhere for that. Meanwhile, the solution generally proposed for a lot of these situations is, if you don't want this to happen, then you need to accept lower conditions. I'm not a huge fan of this argument because it's often coming from people who seem to be perfectly happy accepting better conditions for my sacrifice. And just, you know, as people sometimes say, history doesn't always repeat itself, but it does rhyme. So, this is a picture of Ned Ludd. We can't for sure say that this is anything close to what he actually looks like because he didn't exist. Doesn't mean, though, that he wasn't the face of a major movement in what we'd now call industrial relations. And so if anyone hasn't seen the bottom of that there, he was the Ludd in Luddites. And one of the things I'm fascinated by, and one of the things that my talk at the 2023 PyCon AU in Adelaide was about, is just how ideas and understanding of things evolve, and especially how things like politics play into that. And specific to this case is how the term Luddite in common usage is generally someone who's reflexively anti-technology in general, when that's not actually what the Luddites were. So the original Luddites came from the English textile industry. And so it's probably worth just starting with a brief thing on how cloth is made, or at least at the time. So ignoring the primary industry bit, so, you know, sheep, wool, or cotton, or flax, or hemp, or whatever you're using. Once you've got that fibre, you need to spin that into yarn or thread, and then that needs to be woven into cloth. And then, you know, there are other finishing processes that go on after that, dyeing, you know, various other things. Cropping was an important one, where you had to sort of trim off the fluffy bits to get nice smooth cloth. That comes up. So before automation, this was all done largely by hand. There were simple machines involved, but they were one-person things. And it involved a significant number of people at each stage of the process. You often had family, like literal cottage industries, where a family would be taking in raw fibre, turning it into thread. Like, as you know, one part of the family group would be doing that. Then the thread would be woven into cloth, and then that's sold. So by around 1740, this had evolved to a system where the families involved would receive raw materials from a trader. They would then turn that into cloth, and then the trader would come and collect it and go on to get it dyed or whatever, and they'd pay the family for the work done. And this was known. This was known as the putting out system. Don't laugh. So this. The important point of all this was that a family could support itself on this. The economics of it were well understood, and so you knew for how much cloth, raw material you were getting, how much cloth you'd make, and how much money you'd get. And a family could live not like an amazing life on this, but a very comfortable one. Then you start getting a whole bunch of changes. The flying shuttle was the first one. That allowed the cloth to be made faster. It also meant that a given weaver, it used to be that the width of cloth was limited by the arm span of the weaver. The flying shuttle allowed that to be made wider than that without requiring an extra person working the loom. And then after that, you start getting a bunch of things. You start getting the spinning jenny, which allows multiple threads to be spun at once while also being an amazing band name. And then you get the water frame, which allows water power to drive a loom and weave cloth. Then some mad Scottish person invents a steam engine. This has made many people angry and has been widely regarded as a bad move. And from that, you're then getting the spinning mule, which is a slightly less good band name, but it again sort of thread manufacturing device. And then the power loom or the steam loom. All of these advances met with some level of resistance, even the flying shuttle, because all of them represented less people getting paid for the same amount of work. And all of them get used in various ways to ratchet down the amount of money that a given cloth-producing unit, family in this case, is getting, while meaning more profit for other people further in the chain. But the steam engine and the tools derived from that are where it really sort of kicked off. Once the machines reached a level of capability, and especially once they were getting steam power, initially the need for skilled workers dropped. Steam looms didn't need a skilled weaver to operate them. And there were other parallel advances in that automated the cropping process. And the croppers were very much a very skilled trade. You needed a very good cropper in order to get really good quality fabric, and they were basically out of a job at that point. Instead of the cottage-based systems, you started getting factories. And those factories weren't staffed by people who had to spend years training and learning how to do their craft. They were staffed by, whoever, often children. And this is in, shall we say, very non-union conditions. OH&S had not been invented yet at all. The other thing that led into the Luddite uprising was this guy Napoleon. There was a bunch of wars going on that Napoleon kept starting, sort of the Bruce Lehrman of wars. But that caused a whole bunch of economic hilarity, and which led to the economic situation for the weavers getting absolutely dire. So what do? Well, you could start by asking nicely. You talk to the people who are in charge of the receiving side of all this and say, look, could we not build the factories? Could we build them in such a way so that you're employing people who, need the money? Could we not employ children, maybe? And of course, the response for that was, how about no? I mean, the thing is that some people did respond and change practices, but all it takes, as we've seen time and time again, is one or two people who are willing to put profit above everything else, and suddenly it becomes untenable to stay in the business unless you are also putting profit above everything else. So the next stage is appealing to authority, and so they went to the government and said, hey, can you help out? Exactly. Yeah, didn't work. So then we move on to, I guess, what would these days we call direct action. They started breaking the machines. This is where you actually get the Luddites showing up as Luddites. Ned Ludd was named for a invented character who had a very large hammer, and he would come in and he would break your machines. They were very surgical about it, though. They didn't attack everyone. They attacked. They would go after mill owners and factory owners who were the most obvious at actually trying to screw the workers out, and they would break their machines in specific ways to make them either hard or very expensive to repair. And they were incredibly organised with it. They would run drills. They'd be out on the moors at night practicing their operations so they could just get it all smooth. And it was combined with all of the other things you would expect from this kind of direct action movement. There was more appeals to government, more appeals to other government officials, legislature, the public in general. It was an industrial strike before such things were really thought of as such. And so it all worked, right? It was initially very effective, and it wasn't all, by the end of it, just the cool targeted machine breaking, though. The Luddites did send death threats and the likes, and it did lead up to one mill owner getting killed. But part of the reason it escalated that far was it was so effective that the government got involved on the side of the factory owners. There was legislation passed making the breaking of machines illegal, initially in 1788, with the punishment being transportation. So any Australians in the room should understand where that was going. But then in 1812, machine breaking was made a capital felony, as in death penalty. All of that worked, and the Luddites were put down, and the slow march of history got to work reducing them from a group of people with a legitimate set of grievances but no legitimate way to deal with them to a bunch of out-of-touch weirdos who didn't like change. So the Luddites, they're a lot more complex and complicated, as with a lot of things in history, than they seem on the surface. And as with a lot of historical things that have, that are political and socio-economic in nature, there's a lot more dimensions to it than we're encouraged to think of. They are absolutely forerunners of what becomes the labour and union movement later. And especially the Luddite reaction to the Industrial Revolution, everything came on, was something that got written into a book by Friedrich Engels. The English title is The Condition of the Working Class in England, which in turn was heavily influential on one Karl Marx. Because, when we're talking about Marx, like the means of production is a term that you see used a lot through Marxist writing. And what that generally means is the things that the worker uses or needs in order to produce something. Tools, workspace, all of that kind of stuff. Owning that gives you the ability to control the way production happens, even if you're not actually producing anything yourself. In the case of the Luddites, part of the change they're dealing with is that the means of production had changed, and it had changed in a way that meant they had less control over it. Not just because the machines existed, although that was part of it, but because of the way in which the machines were owned and operated. They didn't own the machines, the mill owners did. So the mill owners could tell them how work was going to happen. And that change was forced on them under terms that they didn't like and weren't allowed to negotiate. They had to adapt or get out of the way. So, coming back to this question, the Luddites weren't successful. The change happened. The genie of automation was out of its bottle and wasn't going back in. And those of us who are in the IT industry now need to know that LLMs are here. And it's now easier to automate some of the work we do. We used to be the ones automating other people out of jobs, and now that might be coming back to us. And so it's entirely possible that our industry could go the same way as the textile industry that started the Industrial Revolution. But we don't necessarily have to accept that in advance. So change is inevitable, but who gets a say in how it happens? The Hollywood strikes that, if you were in Chris's talk earlier, he mentioned the actors and the writers' strikes in Hollywood. They show that direct action is possible. You can dictate how these tools are going to be used in your industry. But when it comes down to just me personally, I'd love to see these tools as useful, but I find it really hard to separate them from the people that own them. I certainly don't want to just quietly accept a future that's envisioned by Elon Musk or Peter Thiel or Sam Altman. But if I had to sort of look at it deeply, one of the things that I really want out of these tools is sustainability, which isn't just one thing. Like, you've got environmental sustainability. The current models are just a disaster environmentally. We were almost at a point where I thought we were starting to do action on climate change, and now that's completely out the window because we need to build this first and then this is going to tell us how to fix it. I don't quite like that. And then also, like, a bunch of data centres that are being apparently constructed around Melbourne have just been given the licence to use huge amounts of water in Australia. This is ridiculous. for these tools to be a viable fixture in our lives, they can't come at the cost of the planet we live on. And speaking of costs, all of these companies, all of the major companies in the LLM space at the moment are financially currently impossible to sustain. All the ones that claim profitability are generally doing it by excluding things like the cost of training their models. And all of them are relying on a lot of them are relying on billions, with a B, of dollars of investment per year to keep operating. And this tells me two things. Firstly, this is growth phase behavior, which means that extraction phase comes next. And if you are now dependent on using their model and they start raising prices or reducing functionality, you're going to be in trouble. And if they are not financially sustainable, then the ability to retrain the models, which has to happen regularly in order to keep them up to date, that stops happening, which all leads to how do we make them societally sustainable? LLMs can't come up with new ideas. They have that, or to be more accurate, they've got no understanding of what they're generating. The reasoning models only work by feeding the output from one model to another and refining the result that way using more resources in the process. They can generate the code, but they can't ensure the code is right or good or safe. They also can't learn new things, and this is where my biggest worry joins everything together. If we, societally speaking, let our skills in this area atrophy, we're letting the LLMs do the work. We put ourselves in a position where we are both beholden to whoever is asserting ownership of the LLMs or the tools around them, and also beholden to wherever we get the skills from to actually make the code useful, assuming we're not just begging the LLM to please take the bugs out this time and paying even more for the privilege. Because that would be us accepting that these people now own the means of production in our industry and that our work, our skills, and to some extent ourselves are no longer valuable. So where do we go from here? Well, firstly, at some level we need to accept that we are working class. We are selling our skills, and that means that we are, we need to find common cause with all the people who are also selling their skills to make a living. Join your union. The ACTU is the peak body for Australian unions. You can go there. They'll help you find out what your union is. If your union would be the Shop Distributive and Allied Employees Association or the SDA, it is not your union. Join the Retail and Fast Food Workers Union instead. Come and ask me outside as to why. Make your union better. The union movement needs to get better at actually advocating for this stuff. Make society better. We need movements that will actually improve stuff outside of the union movement and working alongside it to work together to make society better. Because I individually can't change everything, and we have to at least try. We all need to try, because if we can't make society better, well, that sounds like a skill issue.